Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Brian Blast Baja Blast Processed Ethiopia from the Aviary. And there's the can right there. And the Aviary, based out of Cleveland, Ohio. And let me give you a little bit of background context as to what we have on our hands here today. Beginning with the Aviary, which is a Kickstarter campaign from coffee consultant Christopher Ferran. And on April 1st, he did a collaboration with coffee YouTuber Brian Quan on this coffee. Shout out to Brian, as I'm sure he's watching this video. From what I understand about this coffee, Christopher took coffee green and Baja Blast and combined them together inside of a tank, allowing them to ferment together, resulting in this Baja Blast infused coffee. And during that live stream on April 1st, I actually commented joking that it would make for a pretty good review. And Brian sent me a can of this coffee. So this makes this somewhat of an unofficial review, but as somebody that's loved Baja Blast their entire life, it's a coffee that I definitely was curious about and one I'm looking forward to discussing. This right here is day 27 from when I opened it, but I'm not going to drink it yet as I am saving it for the end of this video as I have something special planned for the end of this video. So let's discuss the recipe that we settled on for this coffee, which was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, about 93 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, definitely a little tricky given the very unique processing method that we do have here today. I can definitely say that it felt like it had a little bit more development than I might have expected going into it. Honestly, didn't really know what to expect. I feel like a lot of people would maybe associate this with slightly more developed side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile, but honestly, it's a guess at this point. With that out of the way though, let's go ahead and start discussing this very unique coffee. Day 1, first impression, and interestingly, the coffee didn't have an overly strong aroma to the brew, nor in the actual cup itself, as it had an almost generic coffee aroma to it. The first impression was surprisingly more fruit forward than I think I was expecting, with an almost peachy quality to it, but it immediately loses that in place of a robust, heavy smokiness. There was a slight citric tone underneath, but other than that, it just left a very odd and unexpected finish to the cup. Day 4, ran it through the Chemex, and the cup did have a little bit more citrus to it, and I honestly wonder how much of this is going to be the priming effect. However, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that there was citrus within this coffee. A lot of the time I was drinking it. Other than that, it almost had this nosedive once again after the bright fruit-forward aspects from that first sip, resulting in a little bit more of this robust smokiness. So it's been interesting, I think a little bit in line with what I expected given the processing method, but the best of this coffee is definitely still yet to come. Day 7, ran it through the April dripper, and the cup continues to start out in this slightly sweet, fruit-forward cup before immediately dropping off. And I think the best way I can kind of describe it is you take this first couple of sips and you're like, oh, this isn't actually bad. And then right after that, it just kind of nosedives into, again, a little bit more of this kind of heavier, fermentier cup overall. On this day, I could say that more of those fermenty red berry, I would say probably lychee, was present in this with not quite as much of the smokiness. Again, a little bit of that unique citric finish, but still at this point, it's just been an interesting coffee, and I haven't necessarily enjoyed it that much to this point, but once again, best is yet to come. As on day 10, lowered the temperatures, ran it through the V60, and it seemed to have a slight bit more life to it in general, as it was interestingly a lot more citrusy. And once again, this could have been the priming effect, but after a little bit of a cool down, it did nosedive a little bit into that fermenty red fruit, but it was much better today because it took more time. Like, it didn't kind of nosedive until it got to very low temperatures, and in that middle ground, you were getting some more of those fruit components to it. So I thought we were working with something positive here. On day 12, made the same adjustments through the Chemex, but really settled on the V60, as the Chemex seemed to accentuate a lot of those fermenty aspects to the cup, with more of those red berry lychee-like aspects present, and being the most defining aspect with also a grainy quality to the cup, things I wasn't necessarily enjoying. So just opted to skip the Chemex from this point going forward, and on day 15, I found the ideal spot for this coffee as I lowered the temperatures even more. And I think the best way I could describe this was it essentially tasted like a slightly more developed version of an Ethiopian coffee, but it was worth the trade-off as the heaviness wasn't necessarily as bad, and there was much more of the noticeable citrus to the cup, as well as a little bit more of a fruit quality to the cup. So there were positives to be taken away on day 15, and I continued to roll with it, as on day 18 I kept the same recipe, and it continues to get more palatable. So interestingly, it's been improving with time as well, as it had this dynamic citrus forward component to it in the acidity, which was a little wonky, a little strange, but I can actually see it being reminiscent of Baja Blast. This is the first time I said, I can kind of see this tasting like Baja Blast a little bit. So it made for a very interesting cup on this day. The more you let it cool down, the more the fermenty red berry aspects open up. But once again, it's surprisingly fruit forward up until that point. Day 21, opted for the final brew to see how close, to see how close I can come to replicating the Baja Blast-like experience, but it continues to offer a little bit more of those red fruits as opposed to anything else. A lingering, zesty finish to the cup. Just okay, so yeah, it was interesting all the way up to that point. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. Once again, saving this sip for the very end. So let's see what we have in our hands here. We have 4 level 4s. So we will start with the finish level 4. That's an interesting one. I think given the processing method, you would expect this one to be a little bit overbearing, a little long lasting, a little heavy in that sense. But even with the heavier aspects of this coffee, it wasn't overly dominant. It wasn't one of those overbearing coffees. I think if you look at this tasting wheel actually looks like a very normal tasting wheel you might expect for a lot of coffees, especially, I don't know, maybe some old school natural processed Ethiopian coffees in general. But yes, the finish there at a level 4, that's not bad. I honestly expected it to maybe be a level 5 going into it. Sweetness level 4, yes, it was still a pretty sweet cup of coffee. A lot of the citrus sweetness to the cup, that was probably the most interesting part of it. There was a lot of brightness, which I think was kind of contrasting the fact that it had a little bit of smoky heaviness to the cup for the majority of the time I was drinking it, but the brightness was there. So I don't really know what happened within the roasting process of this coffee, but I think it just made for like contrasting results within the coffee itself. Citrus level 4, even with as much as I've been harping on the citrus, it's not one of those things that actually goes above that level 4 mark. It was a slightly more even citrus than I might have expected, even if it was a little unorthodox or a little unusual from what I typically expect. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the body level 3. Yeah, it had a kind of medium body to it. I don't really know what to make of that. I think it could be a combination of factors. In theory, you would expect an Ethiopian coffee to have maybe a little bit of a lighter body. Of course, the brew method I opted for was definitely going to have a little bit more body, and then kind of the processing method, don't really know what to make of that. But the cleanliness level 3, okay, that's the lower side of level 3, but being completely honest, it was a lot more clean than I might have expected. It's significantly cleaner than a lot of the standard natural, and especially a lot of the infused or anaerobic coffees that we do review on this channel. So for that reason, I did bump it all the way up to level 3 because there was a little bit of a clean profile to this coffee, even if it was a little wonky at times. A couple of level 3s in terms of the fruits. Grapefruit level 3. I mentioned the red fruit, and I think that's something that both Brian and Christopher noticed a lot more than I did within this coffee. It was present. It opened up a little bit more as it cooled down, but a lot of this tasting wheel was made when the coffee was at its best, when it was at the slightly warmer temperatures, and those red fruit aspects weren't a little bit more dominant within the cup. Stone fruit level 3, yes, I actually experienced a fair bit of peach, and I think that was kind of interesting and unique to me, but it was present within this coffee from me for time to time. But anything else worth discussing? No, honestly, I think that this is a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting at this coffee when I had it at its best. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like people have heard this before, that when I go into one of these coffees, I honestly want it to be maybe as bad as possible. And I will say I was a little disappointed that this one wasn't worse than it turned out to be. This one, in theory, it's something that I could see some, out there coffee roaster releasing, me trying it and being like, okay, well, this is not necessarily my thing, but there isn't anything overly standout-ish about it. I could, in theory, see a little bit of the Baja Blast. I could see how it came together, but in reality, I don't know if I necessarily think that this played as much of a role as maybe I would have hoped it had played. So it just made for an interesting review altogether. It's just a little bit interesting, although not quite to the extent that I might have been hoping for. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: if you do like your slightly more citric sweetness to the cup, as well as maybe a little bit less of clarity in place of those red fruit components, this is kind of the best direction I can steer you towards for this one. It did have a fair bit of sweetness. It wasn't overly dominant. It wasn't overbearing. It wasn't too heavy. So that has some positive aspects to it. It has a weird and interesting brightness to the cup for the entirety of the time drinking it. So that's also another beneficial factor. But I think that's the best way I'm going to leave this part of the review. Now, the moment everybody's been waiting for. So right here, we have a little bit of Baja Blast left. And right here, this is actually a cup of this Brian Blast cold brewed, and we are going to combine them together. And I am every bit as much of a madman as the people that created this coffee are. We're going to see how this turns out. All right. That is more of what I was expecting from this coffee. That is actually weirdly weird. We're not done. I was so disappointed, as somebody that's liked Taco Bell my entire life, I was so disappointed to find out that they no longer have the shredded chicken burrito, so I just went with a classic right here. And we have the Doritos Locos Taco. And I'm a bigger fan of the fire sauce, so I have the fire sauce right over here. And we're gonna take one bite of this, and we're going to see how it combines with our monstrosity of a concoction that we have right over here. Cheers. That is something unique. That is what I was hoping for and expecting from this coffee, but this right here is very interesting. I've made a complete monstrosity, and I think that's kind of the best way I'm going to leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions, but as well, if you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Brian Blast Baja Blast processed Ethiopia from the Aviary. Thank you for watching.